Hi there, I'm your host Marlene McConnell, and welcome to the Surviving Trauma Stories of Hope podcast. In this week's episode, I'm excited to welcome the very astute Dr. Lisa Smith to the podcast, and she joins me from her home in Fort Lauderdale in the USA. Dr. Lisa is an author, an advocate, and professor who provides an honest perspective about solutions for mental health issues regarding the sexual assault and rape of children and teens, which is rarely addressed. She is a psychology, criminal justice, and human services professor with over 20 years of experience as a counselor, hypnotherapist, and advocate for the masses suffering from trauma and abuse. Dr. Lisa is also the founder of right2consent.com, a sex crime reporting site. Her mission is to raise awareness, help prevent, and reduce sexual victimization in America. She questions why we shame vulnerable groups as they tell their stories about sexual victimization. Many are ill-prepared to fend off a sex offender when approached and don't often report the crime to parents or law enforcement. To help, Dr. Lisa writes books that teach students about sexual violence. She writes children's books to teach parents and children about the grooming process, give deterrence tips, and help them identify the signs of sexual violence. With her books, children are taught to be superheroes and learn to help each other bring an undetected sex offender into the light. It has been my pleasure to have Dr. Lisa join me, and I know you will love this episode. Thank you to my listeners for joining me on this journey. Comment on the post on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn and let me know what you think of this episode. Also, head to Amazon and takealot.com and get your copy of my book, Ray of Light, and please leave me a review. It would mean the world to me. Also, please head over to my website and download your free journal prompt and relaxing meditation. As always, stay tuned and keep listening. Hi, Dr. Lisa. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And I love South Africa when I visited. So I feel as if this is something that we must talk about. And it's wonderful that I'm meeting you today.
Yes. And I can't believe you were here just a few weeks ago. I'm sorry that we had to share our load shedding with you. But I think people around the world are getting to know how we operate here in South Africa.
It's funny. No, I was there in January, towards the end of January, but I love South Africa. I was in Joburg and Cape Town, and I paraglided over Cape Town, and it was just amazing. At the Table Mountain, I had a fantabulous time.
I love that. I mean, the trip up Table Mountain is incredible. The views are beautiful.
Absolutely.
And you are very brave, because I said to myself that I would paraglide the day that I publish my book, and I just couldn't do it. So congratulations.
You just have to run and put your feet up, and the parachute does everything else. I'm telling you, I was so afraid until my feet went in the air and we just glided through. It was such a wonderful experience.
No, you inspire me. I'm seriously going to have to reconsider that. Perhaps when I write my next book, or perhaps your next visit to South Africa.
Do it this weekend. Do it this weekend. I'm telling you, it's an experience that you will tell everybody about.
Yeah. No, I can believe it. People say that the views are incredible and it's a very freeing experience. And then landing close to the ocean in Sea Point is absolutely phenomenal.
Exactly. We flew right over the water and then came right back and then came right down the street and stopped right there in a nice big meadow. And it was amazing. It was right off the boardwalk there. It was wonderful. It's wonderful.
That's right.
Experience.
And I mean, I've seen it, and it looks so effortless. The way that you just glide and take a stride, very effortless.
That's exactly what you do. Exactly what you do. So I encourage everyone, if you haven't done it, to do it. It was very freeing for me. I'll never forget the experience.
Fantastic. I am so happy that our country and especially my city could serve in such a beautiful way.
It's
So, Dr.
amazing.
Lisa, you are an author, you're an advocate, you're a professor, and
Absolutely.
you work predominantly in mental health and advocacy around sexual assault and rape, and advocacy around reporting of rape for children and teens. And this for me is an incredibly important topic because when we think about non-reporting of incidents, in my mind, I first of all, I think universities. When this happens at universities, there's usually a certain amount of rapes that go unreported for various reasons. But what you also bring home is that this also happens in the childhood and in the teen years. That can
Yes.
also be something that gets overlooked. As an advocate for sexual victimization, what sort of age group do you look at and you work with in your practice?
So in my practice, I work with families, I work with teens, I work with college students, with elderly, because it is a issue that affects all stages of development. Right? I've seen cases of children as young as 4, and I've worked with people who are 65 years old. So sexual violence does not stop because you are a vulnerable population like a child or a teen. But the reason why my book, The Blaming and Shaming of Defenseless Victims in America, talks about the most vulnerable group is because they're under 18. And so the Me Too movement was very prominent. But what most people don't understand is that Kids Too is probably bigger than Me Too, because many of the women and men in the Me Too movement experienced sexual violence as children. So, and that's not really often discussed, especially in my country, right? And so sexual violence is about vulnerability, power, and control. And they are going to identify the weakest of that population. And so, generally, anyone under the age of 18, because there is some form of dependency. And what most people don't realize is that this is not stranger danger. This is someone you know, right?
Yes.
93% of sexual violent crimes against children and girls and women and LGBTIQ, they know them. They know them.
Yeah. That is a sad statistic, and it's a very high statistic, 93%.
And if we were to look at, just imagine, those are the ones that are reporting, right?
Mm-hmm.
1 in 4, right?
Right.
1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys, if we're talking about the United States, 1 in 5 if we're talking about globally.
Right.
Okay. And then when we start looking at the number of people that were approached but not victimized, or just barely escaped victimization, then that number increases.
Yes. When it is in the household, if I think back to some of the cases that I've seen in my life, where it is somebody that's familiar to the family, a close friend. Even if the family moves away, this close friend would also follow them wherever they go because they need the close proximity to the child. And you'll find that in most of those cases, the parents didn't
Absolutely.
know. So how is it that it's that close to us? It's in our home, but we don't see it.
Well, because the offender grooms the family, right? The offender has to build trust with the parent. And sometimes that is already established, right?
Yeah.
But they look for and spend their time looking for vulnerabilities or weaknesses? How can I get access to this child where their parents don't suspect anything? So that might be in rides home, picking kids up from school, picking kids up from soccer or football practice, picking children up for the movies, taking them to the movies. Oftentimes, they use their own kids as a way in which to build that trust. So it could be a neighbor who is very concerned with their children, and now let's say a mom can't be there to pick up her child, or dad can't be there, then that person steps in and says, I'll do it. Right. So the question is how do I gain access? Right. And friendship. Right. Because,
Right.
or maybe they're a prominent member, maybe they're from the church. Maybe they're from the church. Maybe they're a pastor or a deacon. Maybe they're a coach or athletic person, like I said, a teacher as well. It's to gain access. Many offenders look for jobs and roles where they have access to children.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's to isolate them, right? Because the abuse happens through isolation.
Right.
And then there's also the online piece, right? There are so many people who are online to victimize young, naive children, right? And girls as well, because college age girls,
Yeah.
and like I said, the LGBTIQ community, right? They're all vulnerable, right? And once the victimization happens, how does it affect that child's sexual identity? Not orientation, sexual identity. How do they experience pleasure through the sexual relationships they have in the future with this victimization past?
Right. If we stick with abuse and grooming happening in the home, is there anything specific, Dr. Lisa, that you could provide, parents to sort of be on the lookout for when their child's being groomed?
Yes. So there's a lot of gift giving and there's a lot of secrecy. And so before a child is used for sexual advances, there is a secrecy built. So they may be given gifts, and gifts are sometimes very cheap. If you are a young child and your mom doesn't like you to have candy, it starts it off, right?
Yes.
It could be a new game, or shoes or sneakers, depending on their age. The offender is going to learn from your child what they're most interested in, and they're going to use that. But in the same vein, they are going to use sexual touch. So they might start with touching a knee. If the child doesn't protest about that body boundary, then they may go higher up on the thigh. If the child doesn't protest about that, then they may move to the buttocks area. If there's no protest, then they know, if the protest for a violation of a body boundary doesn't come until the fifth time, then that offender knows, I can touch this child inappropriately 5 different times before the child is going to protest. Right?
Right.
So I teach parents and families, anyone touches you, even if it's because there's some dependency surrounding children when they have babysitters that wash them and change diapers and all these different things, parents and siblings who take on that role as well. The conversation between the parent and the child needs to be more transparent. So and more importantly, the parent has to engage in that conversation with the child. So, so did anyone touch you in your private area, whatever name you choose to give that area?
Mm-hmm.
Did it make you uncomfortable? Did it feel good? Because when you say feel good, that means that it was done for a prolonged period of time,
Wow.
right? And so you're talking about a child who does not know the all the nuances to sexual pleasure. So as they are learning this from the offender, our questions to our children must be more specific.
Right.
right? Because if it is someone being bathed, they shouldn't receive pleasure from that,
Yes.
right? And so now the parents have to ask about that because, like I said, the child doesn't have all the toys in their toy box to cognitively be aware that this is something immoral.
Right. Yes. And I've heard from other survivors exactly these things that you're saying. The grooming started with gifts or magazines. Tell me what you like in the magazine, but it will be an adult magazine. And then also, they would say that during the time they didn't realize there was anything wrong with it. They thought all other girls and boys did this with their abusers.
Right. But it's a sexual exploitation because it starts with the potentiality for groping and molestation, and it moves to introduction of sexual images. And so it might not just be magazines, it might be photos, right? And then the perpetrator or the offender may ask that the child touch his or her body. And so that's why it's a stage, right? They're going to target the family and the child. And they may spend months, sometimes years, gaining this access, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they know their sexual proclivities, but the family doesn't. And in this case, they're looking for a crack in the porcelain, if you will. They're looking for a
Yes.
crack in the routine. They're looking for the access. And once they have the opportunity to gain that access, then they exploit it.
Right. So when we talk about the identification of this violation that happens, for many, unfortunately, it is never identified in their childhood. Or sometimes when it is identified, the family probably does not report it, or if you come from a very staunch religious background, perhaps it's not something that we will speak about. There are various reasons why people don't report. Could you elaborate on some of those reasons?
Yes. In my book, The Blaming and Shaming of Defenseless Victims, I talk about what we call dis theory. Now, in the African American culture, we say if you diss me, it's a disrespect. But I use that same colloquialism to talk about how we are consistently dissing our sexual violence victims. Dis means denial, right? So the victim can deny their own ideology of how could I have let this happen? I must have done something wrong if I was the one this happened to, right? Then there's inaction. So there's the D, the I, the inaction.
Right.
I'm not going to tell anyone. If it's an institution, the school is not going to tell other families that this has happened. They're going to keep it quiet because of litigation, right? And so there's inaction. And so that inaction can happen with a family, it can happen
Right.
with the victim, it can happen with the offender, it can happen with law enforcement. All of that falls into the same dis piece: denial, inaction, and then the last piece is information suppression. DIIS. So if we take that in terms of victims, victims may
Right.
say, well, if it was my pastor, I don't want people to know that I was with him alone. And so shame and guilt enables that inaction, right? And so they don't tell anyone, and they don't
Yes.
do, there's no consequence for the pastor, right? And so there's inaction because they themselves feel as if they've done something wrong and this is the reason why they were victimized. If and then they suppress the information that's needed so that other vulnerable families or girls or boys are not given the information to keep themselves safe. Okay. Now, if we're looking at the offender
Right.
knows that they've crossed the line, but they deny and say, well, she wanted it, or the family should have been watching out. And so this is what the offender's saying. They deny it. And then there's nothing that they do about it because they want to make sure that there's some fulfillment there. There's some reward. There's a sexual response, or the orgasmic response at the end, is pleasure. So they're going to keep that secret, and they're not going to do anything about it. They're not going to stop. And then they're going to suppress that information from the victim, from the child, from law enforcement, information suppression. So that's the offender. But let's look at it on a more global, right? Let's look at it by institutions, right? Because there are so many different institutions. You have
Yes.
these things happen in schools. These things happen in athletic sports, gymnastics. I can go on and on and on about the way in which sexual victimization as a collective, I talk about collective memory. As a community, we are the ones who deny, right? I've had families in which I have families in which parents would
Right.
rather beat their children because they were this vulnerable. Shame their children. Shame, shame their children,
Wow. That is
right?
very
And tell
scary.
them and do nothing. Don't get them counseling, make them
Yeah.
feel bad, inaction, and then suppress the information. Don't tell anyone. Don't tell your aunts, don't tell your uncles that this happened. And I'm just going to do my best to keep that person away from you. But what if it's happening in the family? What if it's a sibling? What if it's a father? Well, that father, when we talked off camera, you talked
Right.
about the normalcy. If you are 6 years old and this has never happened to you, you're going to think that it's normal. If your brother or your sister who babysits you touches you inappropriately, a babysitter, a nanny touches you inappropriately, and you're young and you've never had this experience before, you're going to think this is normal. You're going to think this is what all babysitters do, right? Again, that denial, right? That
Exactly.
inaction and information suppression. And then
Yes.
if we're talking about institutions, some schools require NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, where only few people know. They're going to move the teacher out, like they did with so many priests in the Catholic Church. They're going to move them out of the parish, and that family's going to sign an NDA, non-disclosure agreement, so that nobody else in the community is aware of it. So we collectively, as a community, engage in these disses, right? Denial, inaction, information suppression. And law enforcement does the
Right.
same. Well, what were you wearing? Well, do you know this person? Well, why were you there at night? Why were you there by yourself? Why? I mean, we don't want to prosecute because we don't want to ruin this man's life. This is inaction. This is information suppression. You not prosecuting means that that person becomes undetected. They're an undetected sex offender or rapist, and they can go to other places and do the same.
Yes. But also it sets such a bad and a poor example for others who experience this, who see that there is this inaction and this denial. And so, if it can happen to someone else, why should anyone believe me? Which just perpetuates
Right.
the
Because
problem.
the problem is that we have a community in which there are undetected sex offenders who go to work every day, and no one knows who they
Hmm.
are.
That's a very scary
And
thought,
so
but it's very true.
the reporting is the problem. If we do not know, and if law enforcement won't prosecute, where's the consequence?
Right.
We live in a world of rewards and consequence. If we're not reporting it, then we're only leaving someone else open to victimization.
Hmm. And I also think that for some of the victims of sexual violence and sexual victimization, it's a very difficult topic to bring up with someone close to you, because there's so much shame and guilt, like you alluded to earlier, surrounding the issue of sexual victimization or rape. So what would you say to someone that's listening today that is going through a similar experience, and how do they make that transition from feeling all the guilt and the shame that's associated with the experience to finding that courage to actually speak up?
That's a beautiful name to place on it, courage. Yes, this is something that's very personal. And for those of you who are experiencing it, I'm sorry. The first thing I would say is forgive yourself, right? Because it happens so quickly. In a second, you've gone from normal to victim. So I am so sorry that this is affecting you in this way. And the other thing is, you must get to someone where you can have counseling. But what I advocate for is group counseling. You want to talk to someone who's been where you are, who can give you some of the tools because they're at different stages, right? Who can help you, someone who can talk to you about the triggers. Because talk therapy deals with what's in your conscious mind. Hypnotherapy, EMDR deals with what's meditation, guided meditation deals with what's in your subconscious mind. Remember, we categorize and code trauma through our senses. So, smells, taste, touch, what you felt, what music was playing, or what noises were you hearing, that becomes amplified, but it also gets into different parts of your body that need to, because your body's going into survival mode, right? You're trying to survive. So
Yeah.
first there's the forgiveness piece. Then there's, how do I come back to a new state? Because you're never going back to who you were. How do I come back to a new state? And counseling helps you do that. Individual counseling, but group therapy is so vitally important, I believe, because you need to talk to someone who's been there, someone who
I
understands
agree.
your fear, someone who understands your
That's
shame,
right.
someone who can identify with the nightmares, the insomnia, your feeling of safety, your thought of, does everybody know? Is everybody looking at me this way? Does What are they going to say about me because I couldn't protect myself? Again, please forgive yourself. Talk to that child or that you at that time and say, I forgive you. There was no way you could have done anything to prevent this, because the offender is is using this exploitation for power and control. That's their stuff. That's not your.
Right.
And so yes,
And it's also good
journey.
to make that distinction. And I know it's very difficult to make that distinction in the initial years of the aftermath of something of this level of violence and victimization. But it is important that as we progress on the healing journey through talk therapy, through support groups, and the even
Hmm.
working with sexologists that can help with the transitioning and understanding of certain behaviors that we develop, that we eventually get to that place where we can draw that distinction, that these are things that belong to me and I can do something about it, and those things belong to
Absolutely. And
someone else. That's incredibly wise words, Dr. Lisa.
absolutely. What people don't understand is, now that this has happened, what does it mean for you and how you experience sex and pleasure in the future, right?
That is exactly my next question. Exactly. Yes. Because the impact of the victimization and the sexual trauma that happened in childhood or even in teen years has a direct impact on how we behave as adults when it comes to sexual safety and pleasure in the bedroom.
hmm
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to give you different scenarios.
Okay.
Some victims may become more promiscuous. They may seek out the exact pleasure. If it's repeated, they're going to seek out the pleasure that happened, and it's almost like you're torn. There's a sickening piece of it, but there's also the pleasure piece of it, because this is a victimization. It's a intimate body intimate. It's an intimate body violation, is what I'm trying to say. And it is now, and if there was pleasure felt at any time because of the prolonged period of it, now you're battling yourself. But now you're going to seek out that intensity of that pleasure, because let's understand, sex is euphoric, right? It's drug like.
Right.
And so there are some people who seek that out, who seek out that volatility of it as pleasure, and so they're looking for that, and sex addiction can be a form of that, because they're seeking out the recreation of that pleasurable event, even though it was victimization.
It makes sense to me because I remember reading a statistic that said that after sexual violence, most of the victims reported an increase in sexual activity, which is what you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But I look at that as a dissociation from the body.
Yes.
If somebody can take your body and use it in the way in which they see fit, then you are dissociated from your body. You're dissociated from your emotions. You're dissociated from your sexual identity. And we as therapists have to bring that back. We have to give that back to you. And how do we do that? We go to that point in time and we look at the decision you made in that time. Am I going to die today?
Yeah.
This is so painful. And so we dissociate. It's like a shock where we're not feeling, we disconnect from our emotions, so we're not feeling the violation. And when we do that, we often don't reconnect back to it. And so as a therapist, we have to reconnect that person back to their body so they can start using the responses to keep them safe. And that's where denial comes in, because they feel as if I couldn't keep myself safe. There must be something wrong with me. Right?
Right.
And that's where the denial comes in. But I'm here to tell you, please forgive yourself. No, you shouldn't have been able to. Most of us wouldn't have been able to keep ourselves safe. And there's no fault in that.
Absolutely. So what does all of this mean for us now as adults experiencing this, the aftermath of it? Do you have, I mean, I understand that you say when you're working with a therapist, you really work to sort of connect back to self, because there's this disconnection that happens. And that's where the behavior, the promiscuous behavior sort of develops. But what is that journey back to healthy sexual relationships in the bedroom? What does that look like from a psychological perspective?
First, like I said, the forgiveness piece is really about knowing that there is no way that you could have controlled the situation. Again, it sometimes happens so quickly, and sometimes it's over in less than 5 minutes for many people. But to work back to you is just the acknowledgement that you were victimized, but how do you get back to loving yourself? How do you get to that self-care? And so you want to pay attention and do things that support your self-care, support the way you loved yourself, the things that you like to do, the celebration of you. So we go back to celebrating you before that time. All the things you would have liked to have done. I usually say spend 30 minutes a day celebrating her, getting back to that self-care, doing something just for you, not for anyone else, just for you, and bringing you back to the happiness and the joy you experience, right? Because that's so vitally important to help you move from this now hindrance and barrier. And then when you do that, I tell people to journal. Get all of that anger and that frustration and that guilt and that shame, put it on the page. And I say, many people keep their books, but I say, no, get pieces of paper, write it out and burn it. Have a ritualistic burning so that those thoughts do not consume you, because we use thought loops that are often very negative, especially after trauma. And so this is a way of
Yes.
this is a way in which you journal it. You get every nasty, angry, disappointed thought on the page and burn it. And then the next thing is share it. Share it. Don't keep it secret. They would rather you keep it secret. Share it. Identify it. This happened to me, because that's the way in which you start re-identifying with the feelings associated with it, bringing those feelings and reconnecting to those different feelings. This is what I smelled. This is what I tasted. This is what I wanted after. Bring in those sensory experiences, because that's the way we code memories, through our senses, and share it. Go out and share your story. Write books on it. Write articles on it. Write. Um, go to see young people. Go to see women. Go to see LGBT. Go to see men, because men don't report. Very few report. But many of
Right.
them have been sexually victimized,
Yes.
and many of them were sexually victimized as kids, right? So I'm putting y'all out there. I
Mm.
see you. I know
Yes.
you're out there. Okay. And so that's where you create the support of the community, because you're going to find out that this is happening in so many spaces, and they needed someone to be their voice. The more of us on the grassroots level that talk about this, that demand change in the laws, because many people who rape, the laws put them in jail for a year. They're out, they're back on the street, right? But we also need their voices, because they need to tell us how they are engaging in this victimization. Because the pedophiles in my country, they're back on the street sometimes in 90 days. If there's no evidence.
Wow.
So we need them to also be
Yes.
part of the conversation, because they know the techniques and tools that they use to groom, to find a vulnerable family, to see how they can make an end at a school. We need what they know to start keeping our community safe. So we can't just cast them aside. We
Yes.
need their information as well.
And I think we have to open that conversation to not only the victims, but also the offenders. They also are humans that are broken,
Mm-hmm.
that can reflect on their own experience and can perhaps even seek help for themselves wherever they may find
Well, if
themselves.
it's reported and they know, they are required to seek help, right? But sometimes the they might give medical castration. So basically what it's saying is you're no longer going to experience sexual pleasure. And I don't necessarily think that it should be long term, because some of these people were victimized as children and then developed this sexual proclivity, and then went out and sought this sexual release and response, right?
Right.
Because
Yeah.
I've had 12-year-old who told me, yes, I look for the vulnerable kids, because he was victimized as a child with his father, who was a drunk, who would visit brothels, and they would sexually assault him. And so now he sexually assaults other little boys. And he was 12. Okay?
I mean, this is not a grown man. This is a 12-year
This
old.
is a 12-year-old. Yes. And the horrible thing is
Gosh.
the mother's in on his block. No, yeah, I can't have my kids around him. But nobody's reporting him. My job is to report him. But generally, when we talk about juveniles, because in my country, 46% are juvenile sex offenders. Now, let's say, well, what does that look like? A girl's first sexual experience is that of sexual violence, right? And at the hands of a peer, a boyfriend, a girlfriend if you're LGBT, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I'm saying that the stakes are just too high to
Mm-hmm.
do
And it's very
nothing.
difficult to think of sexual offenders as teens and children. But what you're describing is that is in fact it can start as young as 12. In you know.
In my niece's school, a little boy brought porn to school and was showing it because he doesn't know better. Somebody exposed him. He's showing it to his friends. It's a giggle. It's something funny. I mean, every single one of us has had sexual conversations with our friends that we knew were taboo. We knew we weren't going to go home and tell our parents, but it didn't mean that it wasn't happening, right?
Yeah. Right. Exactly. So, Dr. Lisa, I mean, this is like such an eye-opening and such a revelation for me, this conversation. And I really, I mean, I think that there's so much value from this discussion today the that the listeners can take and apply. And I love how you give us the practical tools that we need in the aftermath of sexual trauma, how to reconnect to the self, what active steps to take through talk therapy, through support groups, speaking to people who understand us on a fundamental level, that can identify with our dark emotions like our guilt and our shame, really recognizing that frustration and the anger that we have, even the deep-seated resentment, and being able to get that out of our bodies through the ritual of writing and then burning that in a ritual, a fire ritual, which it represents the perishing essentially of that experience in a fire. And I think it is so
Mm,
powerful that it's something that has actually helped me in my life exactly the way that you've described it. And so it's something that I can attest to and say, this is in fact how it works. But it all comes back to the power of the choices that we make, right? Like you said, you
mhm,
have to decide that you want to do this, and then stick to
mhm,
it, and report and work and do the work, put in the
mhm,
work for yourself in order to heal and have a more connected experience as an adult. Yeah. So I wanted to move on and just ask you about your books, because you've written more than one book,
right.
and you've mentioned some of your books during our discussion. But for someone that wants to hone in on this and learn more about how we can help parents identify the grooming of their children, how parents can help them, can you perhaps share with us some of the books that you've written?
Sure. So the books for the parents, and if you go on my site, my website is Right to Consent. You have the right to consent, RIGHT, the number two, consent, CONSENT.com. You can find books for parents, The Blaming and Shaming of Defenseless Victims in America's Rape Culture is the one that I have for parents, my college students, and any academic or anyone who wants to find out how we as a community have created this environment and how we continue to perpetuate this environment where the numbers are increasing, not decreasing. But there's also tips and tools to help parents as well as college students. Now, there's books for 5 through 9 year olds who are, in these books, these are kids. These are kids solving the problem. These are kids bringing the problem to light, right? We want them to be superheroes because the most important thing that parents need to know is they may not be there. Most of the time, they're not going to be there when that child is approached. And
Mm-hmm.
that is deliberate. The sex offender does not want the parent anywhere around, does not want, so they can have control and power over your child. And so that's Chad Keeps a Secret. If you don't think that you should talk to your children about these scenarios, the more scenarios a child has, the more they can use the right words. I tell all the kids in my life and all the kids I come across, if someone asks you to keep a secret, you say, I don't keep secrets. I'm going to tell my mom about everything we talk about. I always tell my parents about everything we talk about. So if you think you're going to touch me, I'm going to tell on you. That's going to send the sex offender in the other direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you have to teach your child that they need to use those words. I don't keep secrets. I'm going to tell my mom everything we talked about today, even if you give me candy. Right?
Yeah.
Even if you buy me that cute outfit, okay?
Yes.
But it also starts the conversation so that your child might keep regular secrets like birthday parties or boyfriend, but this is something that should never be a secret. And so those two books, Aaliyah Can't Tell Her Secret and Chad Keeps a Secret, the children are solving the problems. Don't think that your child doesn't want to be safe. If they have the tools, they will do everything in their power to make sure they're safe, as well as your teens. We have a pre-course that's about to come out in another 2 weeks for parents about just grooming. And then what's coming out in September are my teen books, so that teens also are introduced to the topic and the conversations around dinner are worthwhile, right? But kids start to learn, I have to, not only is my parents supposed to keep me safe, but I have to keep me safe.
Yeah.
And what happens to children when they're online, when they're playing these games, when people are pretending they're someone else, right? So these are discussions we need to have openly, not shamefully.
And I think that is also a very important discussion. Another discussion that we need to have is about, what happens online. Because as much as it happens in our physical world, within our space, with neighbors, family members, online is also a place where lots of predators lurk and pretend to be young children speaking to our kids. Dr. Lisa,
Absolutely.
I mean, it has just been incredible having this conversation with you. Your wisdom, your experience, the way that you just articulate this into absolute bite-sized chunks that makes absolute sense. Phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much. Thank you for the work that you do in the field of psychology, specifically around the advocacy and the psychology and the mental health of sexual victims. And we need more people like you in this world to help us to speak out and to help us on our healing journey. Thank you. It's been incredible.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much for allowing me to come here. And you can find me on Instagram, TikTok at Right to Consent. Send me your questions. I am always happy to provide more information.
Yes. To my listeners, as always, please, if you want to follow along, I will leave all of the links for you down in the show notes. And I will also link Dr. Lisa Smith's website for you to read up and to get more information and also get your hands on those books, because it's important that as parents, we take our power back. We take it back from the sexual perpetrators out there, and we educate our kids and we give our kids the tools that we need. And here is a beautiful way through a children's book, two children's book and the adult book nonfiction, that you can empower yourself as a parent and protect your children.
Thank you so much. I appreciate
Dr.
you.
Lisa, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Bye.
Bye.
That wraps up this podcast episode. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy my podcast, please take a minute to give me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast directory so you don't miss an episode. Please consider following My Centered Life on Facebook and Instagram for daily inspiration. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. You can catch me again in the next episode. Same time, same place. Sending you lots of love and light. Bye.